The crack of the riding crop echoed through the marble halls of Ashworth Manor, like thunder on a winter morning, followed by a sharp cry that made every servant within earshot freeze in terror. In the grand entrance hall, beneath the disapproving gazes of ancestral portraits, Dowager Duchess Beatrice Ashworth stood over a trembling young maid, her face twisted with aristocratic fury. "You clumsy, worthless creature!" the dowager shrieked, raising the crop again. "That vase was worth more than your pathetic life. How dare you soil my floors with your incompetence?" Emma Hartwell cowered on the cold marble, her cheek already bearing the red welt of the first strike. The shattered remains of an ancient Ming vase lay scattered around her, its destruction the result of a stumble caused by her worn shoes catching on the Persian rug. At 24, Emma had served in great houses since she was 16, but never had she faced such vicious cruelty. "Please, Your Grace," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It was an accident. I'll work to pay—" "Silence!" The dowager's voice cut through the hall like a blade. "Accidents are luxuries the poor cannot afford. You will learn your place, girl, even if it breaks you." The assembled servants watched in horrified silence as their mistress prepared to strike again. This was England in 1847, where the rigid class system granted the nobility absolute power over their inferiors. The Ashworth family had ruled these lands for 3 centuries, their word as absolute as divine decree. But as the crop descended toward Emma's defenseless form, a powerful hand caught the dowager's wrist mid-strike. "That is quite enough, mother." The voice belonged to Duke Alexander Ashworth, who had just returned from his morning ride. Still dressed in his hunting attire, mud splattered across his boots, he stood like an avenging angel in the doorway. His green eyes blazed with an emotion none had ever seen directed at his mother, raw, undiluted anger. "Alexander!" the dowager gasped, her composed mask slipping for the first time in decades. "Release me this instant. This servant dared to—" "I said enough." His voice carried the authority of generations of noble breeding, but also something else, a moral conviction that seemed to surprise even himself. "No one will be beaten in my house, not while I draw breath." Emma looked up from the floor, hardly daring to believe her salvation had come from the very source of aristocratic power she had learned to fear. The Duke's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and something passed between them, a recognition that would change both their lives forever. The Dowager Duchess straightened her silver hair, her face flushing with humiliation at being challenged before the servants. "We shall discuss this privately, my son, immediately." As the crowd dispersed, Alexander extended his hand to help Emma to her feet. The simple gesture sent shockwaves through the rigid social order of the household, for a duke did not touch a servant's hand, much less offer assistance with such obvious concern. "Are you injured, miss?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle in stark contrast to his mother's harshness. "No, Your Grace. Thank you," Emma whispered, though her voice trembled with the aftershock of terror and relief. But as Alexander watched the young woman curtsy and hurry away to tend her duties, he found himself haunted by the courage he had seen in her tear-filled eyes. Something had awakened in him today, something that would not easily be silenced. The battle lines had been drawn in Ashworth Manor, between old cruelty and new conscience, between the merciless preservation of class distinction and the dangerous stirrings of human compassion. The next morning brought no peace to Ashworth Manor. Word of the previous day's confrontation had spread through the servants' quarters like wildfire, creating an undercurrent of tension that permeated every corner of the grand estate. Emma went about her duties with downcast eyes, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that ceased whenever she entered a room. The Duke defended a common maid against his own mother, she overheard the cook murmuring to the head butler. Nothing good can come of such disruption of the natural order. In the opulent morning room, the Dowager Duchess sat rigid as marble, her breakfast untouched as she plotted her response to Alexander's unprecedented defiance. For 40 years, she had ruled Ashworth Manor with iron discipline, molding her son into the perfect aristocratic heir. Never before had he questioned her authority, much less humiliated her before the servants. Mrs. Pemberton, the stern housekeeper and the Dowager's closest ally, entered with her usual air of disapproval. "Your Grace, I've conducted the inventory you requested. 3 more pieces of porcelain show damage from careless handling by the staff. Perhaps it's time for another reminder of proper respect." "Indeed," the Dowager replied, her voice like winter frost. "But first, we must address a more pressing concern. My son's momentary lapse in judgment yesterday cannot be repeated. The natural order must be restored. Meanwhile, Alexander found himself unable to concentrate on his usual pursuits. The estate's ledgers lay forgotten on his desk as he paced his study, haunted by the memory of Emma's terrified face and his mother's casual cruelty. For 32 years, he had accepted the rigid hierarchy of his world without question, believing it was simply the way things were meant to be. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Enter." Emma appeared in the doorway, a tea service balanced perfectly in her hands, despite their slight trembling. "Your tea, Your Grace." "Thank you, miss." He realized with shame that he had never learned her name, despite her months of service in his household. "Hartwell, Your Grace." Emma Hartwell. As she set the delicate china on his desk, Alexander noticed the angry red mark still visible on her cheek, where his mother's crop had struck. Something twisted painfully in his chest. "Miss Hartwell," he began carefully, "I trust you understand that yesterday's incident was regrettable. My mother's methods, while traditional, were perhaps excessive." Emma's brown eyes met his briefly, before returning to the safer territory of the Persian carpet. "Your Grace is most kind, but I fear my clumsiness invited just punishment. I should not have been so careless." "You believe you deserved to be struck?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. The young woman's composure wavered for just a moment. "It is not my place to question my betters, Your Grace. I am here to serve, nothing more." Her words, spoken with quiet dignity despite their self-deprecating content, struck Alexander like a physical blow. Here was a woman of obvious intelligence and grace, reduced to believing she deserved violence for a simple accident. The injustice of it burned in his throat. "Miss Hartwell," he said slowly, "what if I told you that your worth as a human being has nothing to do with your position in this house?" Emma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been hope. But before she could respond, the sharp click of approaching footsteps announced the Dowager Duchess's arrival. "Alexander, we need to—" She stopped short, taking in the intimate scene before her. Her son stood close to a servant girl, speaking in low, earnest tones that suggested dangerous familiarity. "What is the meaning of this?" "Mother, I was simply—" "You were simple indeed," the Dowager cut him off, her voice deadly quiet. "Miss Hartwell, you are dismissed permanently. Collect your belongings and leave my house within the hour." "No!" The word burst from Alexander with surprising force. "She will stay. This is my house now, Mother, and I decide who serves in it." The confrontation crackled between them like lightning, 32 years of filial obedience, warring against newfound moral conviction. Emma stood frozen between them, a pawn in a game she barely understood, but whose outcome would determine her very survival. "Very well," the Dowager said at last, her voice carrying the chill of impending winter. "But mark my words, Alexander. This foolish compassion will destroy everything our family has built. And when it does, the blame will rest squarely on your shoulders." 3 weeks passed in uneasy tension at Ashworth Manor. Alexander found himself increasingly drawn to conversations with Emma as she went about her duties, discussions that ranged from her thoughts on the books she borrowed from the servants' library to her observations about the changing seasons in the countryside. Her intelligence and quiet wisdom gradually revealed themselves like flowers blooming after winter, and with each interaction, Alexander felt his world-view shifting in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The Dowager Duchess, meanwhile, watched her son's growing interest in the Maid with mounting alarm. She had not maintained her iron grip on the family's reputation for 4 decades by allowing sentiment to override strategy. If Alexander would not come to his senses voluntarily, she would force his hand. On a rain-soaked Thursday evening, Mrs. Pemberton knocked urgently on the Dowager's private sitting room. "Your Grace, I've made the discovery you requested. The girl's background contains exactly the sort of scandal we anticipated." The Dowager looked up from her needlework, her eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "Proceed. Emma Hartwell is not the orphaned daughter of a country vicar as she claimed." Mrs. Pemberton reported with obvious relish. Her father was indeed a clergyman, but one who was defrocked for theft from the church poor box. He died in debtor's prison when she was 19. Her mother descended into madness and drink before dying in a workhouse. The girl has been concealing her shameful heritage to secure employment in respectable houses. "Perfect," the Dowager murmured. "And her current conduct?" "I've observed her speaking at length with His Grace on several occasions. Yesterday I witnessed him gift her a book of poetry from his personal collection. The impropriety is beyond question." The next morning brought Lord Pemberton, Mrs. Pemberton's nephew, and the local magistrate, for his monthly visit to discuss estate business with Alexander. The Dowager had arranged for this meeting with particular care, ensuring that several prominent families from the county would also be present for lunch. As the distinguished guests gathered in the dining room, Emma entered to serve the wine, her movements graceful despite her obvious nervousness at serving such an elevated company. She had just reached Lord Pemberton's chair when the Dowager Duchess rose like an avenging fury. "Stop," she commanded, her voice cutting through the pleasant conversation like a blade. "I will not have this house contaminated by criminal blood for one moment longer." Emma's hand trembled so violently that wine splashed onto the pristine tablecloth. The assembled guests turned in shocked silence as the Dowager continued her devastating attack. "This woman," she declared, pointing an accusing finger at Emma, "has deceived us all. She is the daughter of a convicted thief who died in prison, born of a line of criminals and madmen. She has wormed her way into my son's sympathies through lies and manipulation, bringing shame upon the Ashworth name." The colour drained from Emma's face as every eye in the room fixed upon her with a mixture of disgust and fascination. Lord Pemberton half rose from his seat, his expression one of moral outrage. "Is this true, Your Grace?" he demanded of Alexander, who sat frozen in his chair, clearly blindsided by his mother's orchestrated humiliation. "You've allowed a criminal's daughter to serve your guests?" Emma's legs gave way beneath her, and she sank to her knees amid the spilled wine, her dignity crumbling under the weight of public exposure. Years of carefully maintained composure dissolved as she was reduced once again to the terrified child who had watched her father led away in chains. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the shocked murmurs. "I never meant. I only wanted—" She wanted to deceive her betters and rise above her natural station, the Dowager finished coldly. "Alexander, surely now you see the danger of your misplaced charity. This creature's very presence has made us accomplices to deception." Alexander looked at Emma's broken form, then at the faces around the table, faces that reflected the rigid moral certainty of their class, the absolute conviction that bloodline determined worth, that compassion was weakness, and that the natural order must never be questioned. In that moment something crystallized within him. The choice before him was stark and irreversible. He could preserve his position, maintain his mother's approval, and cast Emma out to face certain destitution, or he could choose a path that would challenge everything he had been raised to believe. "Get up," he said quietly, extending his hand to Emma. The gesture sent shockwaves through the room. A duke did not help a servant to her feet under any circumstances, much less one who had been publicly exposed as a deceiver. "Alexander, what are you doing?" his mother hissed. Alexander's green eyes swept the table, meeting each pair of judgmental gazes with steady resolve. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of generations, but also a moral courage that was entirely his own. "I'm choosing to judge a woman by her character, rather than her father's sins, and I suggest the rest of you examine your consciences before casting stones." The aftermath of the dinner party revelation transformed Ashworth Manor into a battlefield of whispers and divided loyalties. News of Duke Alexander's public defense of a criminal's daughter spread through the county like wildfire, reaching London's drawing rooms within days. The scandal sheets seized upon the story with glee, crafting headlines that painted the young duke as either a noble champion of the downtrodden or a fool seduced by a scheming servant. Emma had tried to leave immediately after the humiliating dinner, but Alexander had forbidden it, a command that left her trapped between gratitude and terror. She knew her presence brought shame upon his house, yet she had nowhere else to go. Every other great house in the county would now close its doors to her, and the workhouse loomed as her only alternative. "Your Grace shouldn't have defended me," Emma told him during one of their increasingly frequent conversations in his study. The formal walls between them had begun to crumble, replaced by something more dangerous, genuine understanding and growing affection. "Your reputation suffers because of my deception." Alexander set down his morning correspondence, which contained 3 more letters from prominent families withdrawing social invitations. "Miss Hartwell, you never lied about who you are as a person. Your father's choices do not define your worth, but they define my place in the world." Emma replied with heartbreaking pragmatism. "I'm exactly what your mother called me, a criminal's daughter trying to rise above her station. Perhaps she was right to expose my pretensions." "Do you believe that?" Alexander asked, rising from his desk to stand near the window, where morning light illuminated the anguish on his face. Do you truly believe that birth circumstances determine a person's value? Emma hesitated, her brown eyes reflecting years of internalized shame, warring against the kindness she had discovered in his presence. I want to believe otherwise, Your Grace, but the world has taught me differently. Their relationship existed in a strange liminal space, too intimate for master and servant, yet too constrained by social reality for anything approaching equality. Alexander found himself sharing thoughts and feelings he had never expressed to anyone, while Emma's natural intelligence and gentle wisdom challenged every assumption he had held about class and character. Meanwhile, the Dowager Duchess was not idle. Her humiliation at being defied so publicly had transformed into cold, calculating rage. She summoned Mrs. Pemberton to her private parlour for increasingly frequent strategy sessions. My son's infatuation with that creature grows stronger daily, the Dowager reported with disgust. Yesterday I witnessed him reading poetry aloud to her in the garden. The scandal will destroy our family's standing if it continues. Perhaps, Mrs. Pemberton suggested carefully, if Miss Hartwell were to leave voluntarily, it would solve the problem without further confrontation. Voluntary departure is no longer sufficient, the Dowager replied, her voice like winter steel. Alexander must be made to see the true consequences of his choices. Sometimes a lesson requires more dramatic instruction. The opportunity came when Lord Pemberton arrived unannounced with news that 3 families had formally complained to the church authorities about Alexander's unseemly association with a servant of questionable morals. The local bishop himself had expressed concern about the scandal's effect on the Ashworth family's moral leadership in the community. Your Grace, Lord Pemberton informed Alexander gravely, I fear this situation has moved beyond mere social awkwardness. Questions are being raised about your fitness to hold your hereditary position on the church board and as a justice of the peace. Alexander received this news with outward calm, though Emma could see the strain in the tight set of his jaw. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows of his study, he shared his fears with her. They seek to destroy my ability to do any good in the world, he said quietly, all because I chose to see your worth rather than your father's failings. Then let me go, Emma pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Send me away tonight, and the scandal will die. Your position will be restored. And what of your position? Alexander demanded, turning to face her with anguish written across his features. What life awaits you out there? The workhouse, worse. It doesn't matter, Emma whispered. I am nobody, Your Grace. You are needed by so many. Your tenants depend on your leadership. Your influence could help countless families improve their circumstances. I won't let my presence destroy all the good you could accomplish. Alexander crossed the room in 3 swift strides, stopping just short of taking her in his arms, a gesture that would have crossed the final line between propriety and scandal. You are not nobody, Emma Hartwell. In the past weeks, you have shown me what true nobility looks like. It has nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. The use of her given name sent a shock through both of them, an intimacy that acknowledged their feelings, while simultaneously highlighting the impossibility of their situation. Your Grace, Emma said brokenly, we both know this cannot continue. Society will never accept what has grown between us. I must leave before you lose everything that makes you who you are. And if I choose to lose it? Alexander asked desperately. If I decide that a life without you is worth less than all the titles and positions they threaten to take away. Emma's resolve wavered for a moment, her heart yearning toward the impossible dream his words painted. But reality crashed back like a cold wave, reminding her of the bitter truth of their circumstances. Then you would become like me, she whispered, homeless, friendless, with no power to help anyone. Is that truly what honor demands, Your Grace? Is love worth the destruction of all the good you might do in the world? 3 days later, the crisis reached its devastating crescendo when Bishop Aldrich himself arrived at Ashworth Manor, accompanied by a delegation of the county's most influential families. The Dowager Duchess had orchestrated this final assault on her son's rebellion with ruthless precision, knowing that public ecclesiastical censure would finally force Alexander to abandon his dangerous course. Emma watched from an upper window as the imposing carriages rolled up the circular drive, their passengers dressed in the black and grey of moral authority. Her heart broke as she recognized the trap that had been laid, not just for her but for the man she had come to love with desperate hopelessness. Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Pemberton's voice cut through her anguish like a blade. Her Grace requires your presence in the drawing room, immediately. With trembling hands, Emma smoothed her simple dress and followed the housekeeper downstairs, knowing she was walking toward her final humiliation. The great drawing room had been arranged like a courtroom, with Bishop Aldrich seated in the place of judgment, while the assembled worthies formed a semicircle of moral condemnation. Alexander stood near the fireplace, his face pale but resolute. When Emma entered, their eyes met across the room and she saw her own heartbreak reflected in his green gaze. "Ah, Miss Hartwell," Bishop Aldrich intoned, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority. "Please stand there, where we can all observe you clearly." Emma took her designated position in the center of the room, acutely aware that she was being displayed like evidence in a criminal trial. The Dowager Duchess watched from her chair with cold satisfaction, while the other guests regarded Emma with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. "We have gathered here today," the bishop continued, "to address a matter that threatens the very foundations of Christian society. Young woman, you stand accused of using deception and manipulation to corrupt a nobleman's judgment, bringing scandal upon one of our most respected families." "Your lordship," Emma began quietly, "I never intended—" "Silence!" Bishop Aldrich's voice boomed through the room. "You will speak only when questioned directly. Now, do you admit that you concealed your criminal heritage when seeking employment in this house?" Emma's throat constricted with shame, but she forced herself to answer truthfully. "Yes, your lordship." "And do you acknowledge that your presence here has caused scandal and brought dishonor upon the Ashworth name?" Tears began streaming down Emma's face as the weight of her circumstances crushed down upon her. "Yes, your lordship." "Then you understand," the bishop said with terrible finality, "that justice demands your immediate removal from this house and from decent society entirely. You will be transported to London and placed in the Magdalene Institution for Fallen Women, where perhaps prayer and hard labor might redeem your corrupted soul." The pronouncement hit Emma like a physical blow. The Magdalene Institution was notorious for its harsh conditions and virtual imprisonment of women deemed morally dangerous. Those who entered rarely emerged, and never with their reputations intact. "No," Alexander's voice cut through the room like a sword. "I will not permit it." The bishop turned toward him with barely concealed anger. "Your Grace, you have already damaged your standing by allowing this association to continue. Do not compound your error by opposing ecclesiastical justice." "Justice?" Alexander stepped forward, his entire bearing radiating the power of his ducal authority. "What justice condemns a woman for her father's crimes? What righteousness destroys a person for seeking honest employment after tragedy befell her family?" "The natural order must be maintained," Bishop Aldrich replied sternly. "When servants forget their place and seduce their betters into impropriety, society itself crumbles. This woman has corrupted your judgment with her feminine wiles, and she must face the consequences." Alexander's jaw tightened as he looked around the room at the assembled faces, people he had respected, whose opinions had once mattered to him. Now he saw them clearly for what they were, guardians of a system that valued birth over character, appearance over substance, conformity over compassion. "Then I choose to stand outside your system," Alexander declared, his voice ringing with finality. "If this is your justice, I want no part of it." The room erupted in shocked gasps and urgent whispers. No duke had ever publicly rejected ecclesiastical authority, much less for the sake of a servant. The Dowager Duchess rose from her chair, her face white with horror. "Alexander, you cannot mean this," she pleaded desperately. "Think of our family name. Think of your duty." "I am thinking of duty, mother," Alexander replied, his eyes never leaving Emma's tear-stained face. "The duty to protect the innocent, to stand for truth over tradition, to choose love over law when law becomes tyranny." He crossed the room and knelt beside Emma, taking her trembling hands in his without regard for the scandalized gasps around them. "Emma Hartwell, you asked me once what I would do if I lost everything. I have my answer now. Your Grace, please," Emma whispered through her tears. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me. I'm not worth it." Alexander's hands tightened around hers, his voice gentle but unwavering. "You are worth everything, and if they cannot see your value, then perhaps it is their vision that is flawed, not your worth." Bishop Aldrich rose to his full imposing height, his voice thundering with divine wrath. "Duke Ashworth, if you persist in this defiance, you will be stripped of your church positions, ostracized from society, and banned from polite company. Is this servant really worth your entire future?" Alexander looked into Emma's eyes and saw reflected there all the love, fear, and desperate hope that filled his own heart. The choice before him was clear and irrevocable: preserve his position in a corrupt system, or choose love and righteousness regardless of the cost. "Yes," he said simply, his voice carrying across the room like a bell tolling the end of an age. "She is worth everything." The silence that followed Alexander's declaration stretched across the drawing room like a chasm, opening between two worlds: the rigid certainty of the old order and the uncertain promise of something new. Bishop Aldrich's face had turned purple with outrage, while the assembled dignitaries sat frozen in their chairs, witnesses to a revolution they had never imagined possible. "Very well," the bishop pronounced with deadly quiet. "You have chosen your path, Duke Ashworth. As of this moment, you are stripped of all church positions and banned from ecclesiastical society. Your moral leadership in this county has ended." The Dowager Duchess let out a strangled cry, collapsing back into her chair as the full magnitude of her son's defiance crashed over her. 40 years of careful social positioning, of maintaining the family's pristine reputation, destroyed in a single moment of what she could only see as madness. "Leave us," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying absolute ducal authority despite his rejection of their approval. "All of you. This is still my house, and I want you gone." One by one, the delegation filed out in scandalized silence, their whispered conversations already beginning the process of social exile that would follow. Mrs. Pemberton cast a final venomous glance at Emma before shepherding her mistress from the room, leaving the Dowager to be helped to her chambers in a state of collapse. When the last footstep faded away, Alexander and Emma remained alone in the vast drawing room, still kneeling together on the Persian carpet that had witnessed their destruction and their salvation in the same moment. "What have we done?" Emma whispered, the reality of their situation beginning to penetrate her shock. "Your Grace, you've lost everything because of me." Alexander helped her to her feet, his hands steady despite the earthquake that had just shattered his world. "I've lost nothing that matters, Emma, and I've gained something worth more than all their approval. The knowledge that I chose correctly when it counted most." But even as he spoke the brave words, Alexander knew the practical consequences of his choice would be severe. Within hours, news of his confrontation with the church would spread throughout England. No respectable family would receive him, no club would admit him, no social gathering would welcome his presence. He would become a pariah in the only world he had ever known. "There will be consequences," Emma said, reading his thoughts with the intuition born of their growing connection. "Terrible consequences for both of us." "Then we'll face them together," Alexander replied, taking her hands in his with a tenderness that acknowledged the magnitude of their commitment. "If I am to be an outcast, at least I'll be one with honor intact." The next days brought the predicted avalanche of social rejection. Letters arrived hourly withdrawing invitations, ending business relationships, and severing social connections. Alexander's steward reported that several tenant farmers had requested meetings to express their concern about serving under a duke who had lost his moral bearings. But amid the chaos, unexpected allies began to emerge. Young Lord Hartley, a progressive member of Parliament, wrote to express his admiration for Alexander's courage in standing against social tyranny. Miss Josephine Whitmore, a noted reformer and advocate for workers' rights, sent a letter praising his defense of an innocent woman against false accusations. Most surprisingly, Dr. Thomas Henley, the respected physician who served many of the county's great houses, arrived unannounced one afternoon with startling news. "Your Grace," Dr. Henley announced as he was shown into Alexander's study, "I've come to apologize for my silence during recent events and to share information that might interest you." Alexander looked up from the correspondence he had been struggling to answer, letters from the few friends who still maintained contact despite the scandal. "Dr. Henley, you're welcome here regardless of your position on recent events." "That's just it, Your Grace. I've discovered that my position was based on false information." The elderly physician settled into a chair, his expression troubled. "I've spent considerable time investigating Miss Hartwell's background after witnessing the character assassination she endured." Emma, who had been arranging flowers in the corner of the room, froze at the mention of her name. "What I found," Dr. Henley continued, "contradicts everything your mother and Mrs. Pemberton claimed. Miss Hartwell's father, Reverend Samuel Hartwell, was indeed charged with theft from the poor box. However, church records show that he was posthumously cleared of all charges when the real thief, the church treasurer, confessed on his deathbed. The revelation struck like lightning. Emma dropped the vase she had been holding, its crash echoing through the sudden silence. Furthermore, Dr. Henley went on, Reverend Hartwell died not in debtor's prison, but in the charity ward of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where he had been taken after collapsing from overwork while ministering to the poor. Miss Hartwell's mother did indeed suffer from melancholia after her husband's death, but she died peacefully in the home of her sister, not in a workhouse. Emma sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this vindication of her family's honor. But the records? Mrs. Pemberton said she had documents. Forged, Dr. Henley stated flatly, or at least deliberately misrepresented. I suspect certain parties were eager to find scandal where none existed and were not particular about the truth of their accusations. Alexander's face darkened with a fury colder and more dangerous than any he had previously displayed. My mother knew the truth. I cannot say what she knew, Your Grace, but I can say that the information used to destroy Miss Hartwell's reputation was false from beginning to end. She is the daughter of a respected clergyman who died serving others, not a criminal's child as was claimed. The vindication should have brought joy, but Emma felt only a crushing sense of waste. It doesn't matter now, she said quietly. The damage is done. Your Grace has sacrificed everything based on lies. Alexander crossed to where she sat and knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. Emma, I didn't sacrifice everything for your innocence, though knowing it brings me joy. I sacrificed everything for the principle that character matters more than bloodline, that love transcends social barriers, that a person's worth isn't determined by their circumstances. And I would make the same choice again, he continued, his voice filled with quiet conviction, even if you were exactly what they claimed. Because the woman I've come to know and love would be worthy of respect regardless of her father's failings or her family's circumstances. Dr. Henley cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may suggest, Your Grace, this information might be shared with certain influential parties. Public vindication could restore both your reputations. But Alexander shook his head, his decision already clear. Thank you, Dr. Henley, but our course is set. We'll face the future based on the choices we've made, not seek redemption through belated revelations of innocence. 5 years later, the autumn sun cast golden light across the gardens of Hartwell House, a modest but elegant estate in the Cotswolds that had become home to one of England's most unconventional yet respected couples. Emma Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth in name but revolutionary in practice, knelt among the rose bushes she had planted to commemorate each year of her marriage to Alexander. The scandal of 1847 had indeed destroyed Alexander's position in traditional society, exactly as predicted. He had been stripped of his church rolls, banned from London's fashionable circles, and ostracized by the aristocratic families who had once courted his favor. But in losing the approval of the narrow-minded, he had gained something far more valuable, the respect of England's growing reform movement, and the love of a woman whose character had proven stronger than steel. The children from the village school have arrived, my love, Alexander called from the terrace, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had found his true calling. At 37, he looked younger than he had at 32. The burdens of social pretense lifted from his shoulders, along with the weight of living others' expectations. Emma rose from the garden, brushing soil from her simple but well-cut dress, and smiled at the sight that greeted her. 30 children from the local village stood in neat rows on their lawn, their faces bright with anticipation for the weekly reading lesson she provided free of charge. Education for the poor had become her passion, just as social reform had become Alexander's. Mrs. Thompson, Emma addressed the schoolmistress who accompanied the children, I hope you'll stay for tea afterward. I'd love to hear about young Sarah's progress with her letters. With pleasure, Your Grace, Mrs. Thompson replied, using the title with genuine respect rather than the grudging acknowledgement of social necessity. In this corner of England, the Ashworths had built something new, a community based on mutual aid rather than rigid hierarchy, where a duke might teach reading to tenant farmers' children and a duchess might personally tend the sick without thought of social contamination. As Emma began the day's lesson, reading from a collection of moral tales designed to inspire rather than intimidate, Alexander reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. The social exile that had seemed like death 5 years ago had proved to be rebirth. Freed from the expectations of his class, he had discovered talents and inclinations he had never known he possessed. His progressive politics, once constrained by the need to maintain aristocratic relationships, now found full expression in his work with Lord Hartley's Parliamentary Reform Committee. His wealth, no longer required for maintaining appearances in London society, funded schools, medical clinics, and improved housing for rural workers. His influence, though diminished in traditional circles, had grown immensely among the emerging middle class and reform-minded intellectuals who would shape England's future. "Your Grace," called young Timothy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son whose quick mind had caught Emma's attention, "will you read us the story about the princess and the pauper?" Emma smiled, recognizing the boy's fascination with tales that challenged social boundaries. "I think instead we'll read about real people who changed the world through courage and kindness. Would you like that?" A chorus of eager agreement rose from the children, and Emma opened a volume she had compiled herself, stories of ordinary people who had performed extraordinary acts of moral courage. These tales, she had learned, inspired young minds far more effectively than fairy stories of magical transformations. As the lesson progressed, Alexander noticed a familiar carriage approaching through the trees. Dr. Henley, now their closest friend and frequent visitor, descended with his usual energetic bustle, followed by an elegant woman Alexander didn't immediately recognize. "Your Grace," Dr. Henley called as he approached the group gathered on the lawn. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I've brought someone who insisted on meeting you both." The woman stepped forward, revealing herself to be perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed but not ostentatiously so, with kind eyes and an air of purposeful determination. "Your Graces, I am Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, and I've travelled from London specifically to thank you." Emma concluded the reading and asked Mrs. Thompson to supervise the children's writing exercises while she and Alexander received their unexpected guest. They settled in the comfortable sitting room that served as both private family space and informal reception hall for the steady stream of visitors who came seeking advice, assistance, or simply the example of their unconventional life. "Mrs. Morrison," Alexander began, "you mentioned thanks, but I confess we've never met. Not directly, Your Grace, but your influence has shaped my daughter's life profoundly." Mrs. Morrison's voice carried deep emotion barely held in check. 3 years ago, my daughter Charlotte fell in love with a young man of lower station, a clerk in her father's business. My husband threatened to disown her if she pursued the attachment. Emma leaned forward, recognizing the familiar pattern of a story that had become all too common since their own scandal had become public knowledge. "Charlotte had heard of your story, Your Grace," Mrs. Morrison continued, addressing Emma directly. "How you had risen above circumstance through character, and how His Grace had chosen love over social expectation. Your example gave her courage to follow her heart despite her father's opposition." "And the outcome?" Alexander asked gently. Mrs. Morrison's face broke into a radiant smile. "They married 2 years ago and are expecting their first child. More importantly, my husband has come to see the young man's worth and has made him a partner in the business. Our family is stronger now, not weaker, for following our hearts rather than social convention." The story warmed Emma's heart, but also highlighted the strange legacy they had created. Across England, their names had become symbols of different things to different people: scandal to conservatives, inspiration to progressives, proof that love could triumph over social barriers to romantics. "Mrs. Morrison," Emma said softly, "I'm glad Charlotte found happiness, but I hope she understands that such choices require courage for their own sake, not because others have walked the path before." "Oh, she does, Your Grace. But sometimes courage needs examples to show it's possible." As the afternoon faded and their visitors departed, Alexander and Emma walked hand in hand through the gardens that had become a symbol of their new life, beautiful, productive, and grown from soil that others had dismissed as unsuitable for cultivation. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked, a question that had become ritual between them. "The life you gave up, the position you held." Alexander stopped walking and turned to face his wife, seeing in her face the same beauty that had first caught his attention, now deepened by 5 years of shared purpose and genuine partnership. "I regret only that it took me so long to find the courage to choose correctly," he replied, as he always did. "And you?" he asked in return. "Do you regret the simple life you might have led?" Emma smiled, thinking of the children whose lives they touched, the reforms they had helped inspire, the love that had grown between them beyond anything she had dared dream possible. "I regret only that it took a false accusation to bring us together," she answered, "though perhaps some good can come from even the worst intentions." As they walked back toward the house where their own children, 2-year-old Samuel and infant Grace, waited with their nurse, Emma reflected on the strange justice of their story. The Dowager Duchess, now living quietly in Bath on a reduced income, had ultimately achieved the opposite of her intentions. Her son's marriage to a servant had indeed changed the family forever, but toward greater honor rather than disgrace, toward true nobility rather than empty titles. The natural order had been disrupted, just as she had feared, but in its place had grown something better, a marriage based on mutual respect, a life devoted to service rather than privilege, and a love that had proven stronger than social convention. In the end, Emma thought as she and Alexander reached their front door, perhaps the greatest revolution was simply the radical act of choosing to see people as they truly were, rather than as society demanded they be seen. It was a revolution that began in the heart, spread through courage, and changed the world one choice at a time. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.